Good afternoon. So, we will continue from where we last stopped yesterday. Name of the chapter is The Shoemaker from the book A Tale of Two Cities. We were introduced to three characters up till now. First was the shoemaker, who was an old man, and he is in the process of making a shoe right now. The next character was Monsieur Defarge, who comes to meet the shoemaker, and he brings along another person, that is Mr. Lorry. So yesterday we discussed about how they were talking, and we stopped when Mr. Defarge tells him that he has a visitor. So we'll continue from where we stopped. Here you have a visitor, you see, Monsieur Defarge, said Monsieur Defarge. What did you say? Here is a visitor. The shoemaker looked up as before, but without removing a hand from his work. So he continued working on his shoe, and while working on his shoe, he looks up to see who the second gentleman was. Come, said Defarge. Here's Monsieur, who knows a well-made shoe when he sees one. Show him that shoe that you are working on. Take it, Monsieur. Right, so he tells Mr. Lorry to come inside the room, and also tells him to take the shoe that the shoemaker was working on. Mr. Lorry took it in his hand. Tell Monsieur what kind of shoe it is, said the maker's name. Right, so Defarge tells the old man to tell Mr. Lorry what kind of shoe that he was making, and the maker's name. Maker's name meaning the shoemaker's name. He also tells the shoemaker to tell Mr. Lorry his name. There was a longer pause than usual before the shoemaker replied. So before the shoemaker could reply, there was a long pause. I forgot what it was you asked me. What did you say? I said, couldn't you describe the kind of shoe for Monsieur's information? So Mr. Lorry once again repeats his question to the old man and tells him to describe the shoe that he was making. So the old man says, it is a lady's shoe. It is a young lady's walking shoe. Right, so he describes the shoe. He says a shoe that is made for women, and it is a walking shoe. It is in the present mode. Present mode meaning that he's been working on it presently. I never saw the mode. He says, I've never seen this kind of shoe anywhere. I've had a pattern in my hand. He says this pattern is coming directly as I am making it. He glanced at the shoe with some little passing touch of pride. So he's feeling very proud of himself, the old man. He is feeling proud of himself that he is making a kind of shoe that has never been made before. And Defarge says, and the maker's name? And he says, what is your name? Now that he had no work to hold, now remember the shoe that he was working on, he gives it to Mr. Lorry to hold. So he has nothing in his hands. His hands are empty. He laid the knuckles of the right hand in the hollow of the left. Right, so you can try doing it yourself. Take your knuckles, your knuckles where they are, and of your right hand, and place them in the hollow of your left and put it in the left hand. And then the knuckles of the left hand in the hollow of the right. Right, so that's what he did. He took the knuckles, put it in his left hand, and then the knuckles of his left hand, he puts it in the hollow of his right hand, and then passed a hand across his bearded chin, and so on in regular changes. So he kept doing this without a moment's intermission, and he kept doing this without taking a break. The task of recalling him from the vagrancy into which he always sank when he had spoken was like recalling some very weak person from a swoon, or endeavoring in the hope of some disclosure to stay the spirit of a fast dying man. Now check out these meanings first. Vagrancy means homelessness, and swoon means faint. So they say the task of recalling him from the vagrancy into which he always sank. Now the old man would always go into deep thought. Now over here, Defarge tells him to say his name, and the old man goes into deep thought. Now you have to remember that this man has been in prison for several years, right? So he has lost his memory, because before becoming a shoemaker he was a doctor, but now he's forgotten that he was a doctor. He thinks that he is a shoemaker, so he has lost his memory. So that's why they say the task of recalling him from the vagrancy into which he always sank when he had spoken was like recalling some very weak person from a swoon, or endeavoring in the hope of some disclosure to stay the spirit of a fast dying man, right? So he would go into his own world and he would start thinking. Now over here, Defarge tells him to say his name, and so he starts thinking. Did you ask me for my name? Assuredly I did. And what does he reply? He says that his name is 105 Notta. Right, so now this is not a name, 105 Notta. In fact, this was when he was in prison. This is the tower that he was residing in, that he was living in. So you see, with the memory loss, not only has he forgotten his name, but he still feels that he is in prison, right? And he still feels that he is in 105 North Tower. Is that all? 105 North Tower. With a weary sound that was not a sigh nor a groan, he bent to work again until the silence was again broken. With a weary sound, weary meaning a very weak sound, very faint sound, he begins doing what he was doing, that is, with the shoe. His haggard eyes turned to Defarge, as if he would have transferred the question to him. But as no help came from that quarter, they turned back on the questioner when they had sought the ground. I am not a shoemaker by trade. No, I was not a shoemaker by trade. I learnt it here. I taught myself. I asked leave to, and then blank. So he tells them that he was not a shoemaker, and he's trying to remember what was he. Now we know that he was a doctor, right? So he repeats, he says, I was not a shoemaker by trade. He says, I learnt it here. I taught myself. So he says, in prison, I learnt it. And he taught himself how to repair shoes, how to make shoes, how to mend shoes. He lapsed away even for minutes, ringing those measured changes on his hands the whole time. His eyes came slowly back at last to the face from which they had wandered. When they rested on it, he startled and resumed in the manner of a sleeper that moment awake, reverting to a subject of last night. Right, so lapse means no longer valid. Reverting means to go back. Right, so while telling them that he was not a shoemaker, right, there is silence, and again his eyes, he goes back into some deep thought, and gradually he comes back to the present mode. I asked leave to teach myself, and I got it with much difficulty after a long while, and I have made shoes ever since. Right, so he tells them that he taught himself how to make shoes, right, and he learned it. And he says, now he comes back. Now remember where he stopped? He stopped at I asked leave to, and then there was a pause, and then he continues. He says, I asked leave to teach myself, and I got it with much difficulty. after a long while. So he says, I took permission so that I could teach myself this trade. And he says, I got it with much difficulty after a very long period of time, and I have made shoes ever since. So he says, after a long time, I was given permission to start making shoes. And he says, from that day onwards, I have only been making shoes. That's why he is known as the shoemaker. Now we have around 1.5 page left, which I'll make a video for you on Monday, and we will finish this chapter by Monday onwards. Monday I'll finish this chapter. Tuesday we will continue with the questions. They're not many questions, they're just 5 questions, and there are 2 reference to context. So we will discuss the questions on Tuesday. Monday I shall finish the chapter with you. Right? So that's it for today, and we will continue on Monday. Have a nice weekend and stay safe and stay indoors. Bye.